Welcome back, adventurers, to the continuing adventures of Tolwyn Taleteller. He is collecting books and has been sent to retrieve some for the College of Winterhold. We have now returned to the college. That's where we're sitting. But we'd like to read these books, so that's what we'll do first before we hand them back in. And what do we have? We have a photo mode, which is a new mod that I just installed on this. Very interesting. Anyway, we said we would read our books, so let's do that. We have Hanging Gardens, which we retrieved for one quest, and then we have these that we retrieved together with Night of Tears for another one. So let's read this one first. Hanging Gardens of Western Corridel. This book was apparently written in Dwemer and translated to Aldmeris. Only fragments of the Aldmeris are readable, but it may be enough for a scholar of Aldmeris to translate fragments of other Dwemer books. Guide Altman Estrel led with food flames for the town center where lay dead the quadrangular gardens. Ask the foundations and chains and vessels their naming places. Why they did not use solid sound to teach escape from the earth bones nor nourish them with frozen flames. The worders shall have once written of this art our lesser cousins speak of when their admirable ignorance. But neither words nor experience cleanses the essence of the strange and terrible ways of defying our ancestors' transient rules. The translation ends with the comment in Dwemer in a different hand, which you may translate as follow, or which may be translated as follows. Put down your ardent cutting globes, unblittled. Your Aldmeris has the correct words, but they cannot be properly misinterpreted. This makes no sense whatsoever, but okay, that is Hanging Gardens. Then we have The Black Arrow, Volume 1, The Doors of Oblivion, Last King of the Ayleids, and Night of Tears. I don't remember the order. Okay, The Black Arrow, Part 1, Gorgic Egwene. I was young when the Duchess of Oda hired me as an assistant footman at her summer palace. My experience with the ways of the titled aristocracy was very limited before that day. There were wealthy merchants, traders, diplomats, and officials who had large operations in Eldenroot and ostentatious palaces for entertaining, but my relatives were all far from those social circles. There was no family business for me to enter when I reached adulthood, but my cousin heard that an estate far from the city required servants. It was so remotely located that there were unlikely to be many applicants for the positions. I walked for 5 days into the jungles of Valenwood before I met a group of riders going in my direction. They were 3 Bosmer men, 1 Bosmer woman, 2 Breton women, and a Dunmer man. Adventurers from the look of them. Are you also going to Moliva? Asked Prolissa, one of the Breton women, after we had made our introductions. I don't know what that is, I replied. I'm seeking a domestic position with the Duchess of Oda. We'll take you to her gate, said the Dunmer Misson Arkin, pulling me up to his horse. But you would be wise not to tell her grace that students from Oliva escorted you. Not unless you don't really want a position in her service. Arkin explained himself as we rode on. Moriva was the closest village to the Duchess' estate, where a great and renowned archer had retired after a long life of military service. His name was Heomast, and though he was retired, he had begun to accept students who wished to learn the art of the bow. In time, when word spread of the great teacher, more and more students arrived to learn from the master. The Breton women had come down all the way from the western reach of High Rock. Akin himself had journeyed across the continent from his home near the great volcano in Morrowind. He showed me the ebony arrows he had brought from his homeland. I had never seen anything so black. From what we've heard, said Kopale, one of the Bosmer men, the Duchess is an imperial whose family has been here even before the empire was formed. So you might think that she was accustomed to the common people of Valenwood. Nothing could be further from the truth. She despises the village and the school most of all. I suppose she wants to control the traffic in her jungle, laughed Polissa. I accepted the information with gratitude and found myself dreading more and more my first meeting with the intolerant Duchess. My first sight of the palace through the trees did nothing to assuage my fears. It was nothing like any building I had ever seen in Valenwood. A vast edifice of stone and iron with a jagged row of battlements, like the jaws of a great beast. Most of the trees near the palace had been hewn away long ago. I could only imagine the scandal that must have caused, and what fear the Bosmer peasants must have had of the Duchy of Voda to have allowed it. In their stead was a wide grey-green moat circling in a ring around the palace, so it seemed to be on a perfect, if artificial, island. I had seen such sights in tapestries from high rock in the Imperial province, but never in my homeland. "There'll be a guard at the gate, so we'll leave you here," said the king, stopping his horse in the road. "It'd be best for you if you weren't damned by association with us." I thanked my companions and wished them good luck with their schooling. They rode on, and I followed on foot. In a few minutes' time I was at the front gate, which I noticed was linked to tall and ornate railings to keep the compound secure. When the gatekeeper understood that I was there to inquire about the domestic position, he allowed me past and signaled to another guard across the open lawn to extend the drawbridge and allow me to cross the moat. There was one last security measure, the front door. An iron monstrosity with the Voda coat of arms across the top, reinforced by more strips of iron and a single golden keyhole. The man standing guard unlocked the door and gave me passage into the huge, gloomy grey stone palace. Her Grace greeted me in her drawing room. She was thin and wrinkled like a reptile, cloaked in a simple red gown. It was obvious that she never smiled. Our interview consisted of a single question. "Do you know anything about being a junior footman in the employment of an imperial noblewoman?" Her voice was like ancient leather. "No, Your Grace." "Good. No servant ever understands what needs to be done, and I particularly dislike those who think they do. You're engaged." Life at the palace was joyless, but the position of junior footman was very undemanding. I had nothing to do on most days except to stay out of the Duchess's sight. At such times I usually walked 2 miles down the road to Moliva. In some ways there was nothing special or unusual about the village. There are thousands of identical places in Valenwood, but on the hillside nearby was Master Heomaster's archery academy, and I would often take my luncheon and watch the practice. Polis and Akin would sometimes meet me afterwards. With Akin the subjects of conversation very seldom strayed far from archery. Though I was very fond of him, I found Polissa a more enchanting companion, not only because she was pretty for a Breton, but also because she seemed to have interests outside the realm of marksmanship. "There's a circus in High Rock I saw when I was a little girl, called the Quill Circus," she said during one of our walks to the woods. "They've been around for as long as anyone can remember. You have to see them if you ever can. They have plays and sideshows and the most amazing acrobats and archers you've ever seen. That's my dream, to join them someday when I'm good enough." "How will you know when you're a good enough archer?" I asked. She didn't answer, and when I turned I realized that she had disappeared. I looked around bewildered until I heard laughter from the tree above me. She was perched on a branch, grinning. "I may not join as an archer, but maybe I'll join as an acrobat," she said. "Or maybe as both. I figured that Valenwood could be the place to go to see what I could learn. You've got all those great teachers to imitate in the trees here, those ape men." She coiled up, bracing her left leg before springing forward on her right. In a second she had leapt across to a neighboring branch. I found it difficult to keep talking to her. "The Imker, you mean?" I stammered. "Aren't you nervous up at that height?" "It's a cliché, I know," she said, jumping to an even higher branch, "but the secret is not to ever look down. Would you mind coming down?" "I probably should anyhow," she said. She was a good 30 feet up now, balancing herself, arms outstretched, on a very narrow branch. She gestured toward the gate, just barely visible on the other side of the road. This tree is actually as close as I want to get to your Duchess's palace. I held back a gasp as she dove off the branch, somersaulting until she landed on the ground, knees slightly bent. That was the trick, she explained, anticipating the blow before it happened. I expressed to her my confidence that she would be a great attraction at a quill circus. Of course, I know now that was never to be. On that day, as I recall, I had to return early. It was one of the rare occasions when I had work of a sort to do. Whenever the Duchess had guests, I was to be at the palace. That is not to say that I had any particular duties, except to be seen standing at attention in the dining room. The stewards and maids worked hard to bring in the food and clear the plates afterwards, but the footmen were purely decorative, a formality. But at least I was an audience for the drama to come. Ooh, where is the next part? The Doors of Oblivion by Save Hija. Okay. When thou enterest into oblivion, oblivion entereth into thee. Naiterolar. The greatest mage who ever lived was my master Moriang Zenas. You have heard of him as the author of the book Oblivion, the standard text for all on matters Daedric. Despite many entreaties over the years, he refused to update his classic book with his new discoveries and theories, because he found that the more one delves into these realms, the less certain one is. He did not want conjecture, he wanted facts. For decades before and after the publication of Oblivion, Zenas compiled a vast personal library on the subject of Oblivion, the home of the Daedra. He divided his time between his research and personal magical growth, on the assumption that should he succeed in finding a way into the dangerous world beyond and behind ours, he would need much power to wander its dark paths. 12 years before Zenas began the journey he had prepared his life to make, he hired me as an assistant. I possessed the 3 attributes he required for the position. I was young and eager to help with that question. I could read any book once and memorize its contents, and despite my youth, I was already a master of conjuration. Zenas, too, was a master of conjuration, indeed a master at all the known and unknown schools, but he did not want to rely on his ability alone in the most perilous of his research. In an underground vault, he summoned Daedra to interview them on their native land, and for that he needed another conjurer to make certain they came, were bound, and were sent away again without incident. I'll never forget that vault, nor for its look, which was plain and unadorned, but for what you couldn't see. There were scents that lingered long after the summoned creatures had left, flowers and sulphur, sex and decay, power and madness. They haunt me still to this very day. Conjuration, for the layman, unacquainted with its workings, connects the caster's mind with that of the summoned. It is a tenuous link, meant only to lure, hold, and dismiss, but in the hands of a master it can be much stronger. The Psijics and Dwemer can, in the Dwemer's case perhaps I should say could, connect with the minds of others, and converse miles apart, a skill that is sometimes called telepathy. Over the course of my employment, Zenas and I developed such a link between one another. It was accidental, a result of 2 powerful conjurers working closely together, but we decided that it would be invaluable should he succeed in traveling to Oblivion. Since the denizens of that land could be touched, even by the skills of an amateur conjurer, it was possible we could continue to communicate while he was there, so I could record his discoveries. The doors to Oblivion, to use Moriang Zenas' phrase, are not easily found, and we exhausted many possibilities before we found one where we held the key. The Psijics of Artaeum have a place they call the Dreaming Cave, where it is said one can enter into the Daedric realms and return. Yahasis, Sotasil, Nematig, and many others have been recorded as using this means, and despite many entreaties to the order, we were denied its use. Celerus, the leader of the order, has told us it has been sealed off for the safety of all. We had hopes of using the ruins of the battle spire to access Oblivion. The Weir Gate still stands, though the old proving grounds of the Imperial Battle Mages itself was shattered some years ago in Jagathar's time. Sadly, after an exhaustive search through the detritus, we had to conclude that when it was destroyed, all access to the realms beyond, the Soul Cairn, the Shade Perilous, and the Havoc Wellhead had been broken. It was probably for the good, but it frustrates our goal. The reader may have heard of other doors, and he may be assured we attempted to find them all. Some are pure legend, or at any rate not traceable based on the information left behind. There are references in lore to Mau's Abyss, the Corrington Mirror, the Mentalon Crux, the Crossroads, the Mouth, a riddle of an alchemical formula called Jacinth, and the Rising Sun, and many other places and objects that are said to be doors, but we could not find. Some exist but cannot be entered safely. The whirlpool in the Abyssinian called Maelstrom of Baal can make ships disappear, and maybe a portal into oblivion, but the trauma of riding its waters would surely slay any who tried. Likewise, we did not consider it worth the risk to leap from the Pillar of Thras, a 1,000-foot tall spiral of coral, though we witnessed the sacrifices the Slodes made there. Some victims were killed by the fall, but some indeed seemed to vanish before being dashed on the rocks. Since the Slodes did not seem certain why some were taken and some died, we did not favor the odds of the plunge. The simplest and most maddeningly complex way to go to oblivion was simply to cease to be here and begin to be there. Throughout history there are examples of mages who seem to travel to the realms beyond ours, seemingly at will. Many of these voyages are long dead, and if they ever existed, but we were able to find one still living. In the tower of Zafirbel Bay on the island of Vardenfell in the province of Morrowind, there exists a very old, a very reclusive wizard named Divaith Fear. He was not easy to reach, and he was reluctant to share with Morian Zenas the secret door to oblivion. Fortunately, my master's knowledge of lore impressed Fear, and he taught him the way. I would be breaking my promise to Zenas and Fear to explain the procedure here, and I would not divulge it even if I could. If there is dangerous knowledge to be had, that is it. But I do not reveal too much to say that Fear's scheme relied on exploiting a series of portals to various realms created by a Telvanni wizard long missing and presumed dead. Against the disadvantage of this limited number of access points, we weighed the relative reliability and security of the passage and considered ourselves fortunate in our informant. Morian Zenas then left this world to begin his exploration. I stayed at the library to transcribe his information and help him with any research he needed. Dust, he whispered to me on the first day of his voyage. Despite the inherent dreariness of the word, I could hear his excitement in his voice echoing in my mind. I can see from one end of the world to the other, in a million shades of grey. There is no sky or ground or air, only particles floating, falling, whirling about me. I must levitate and breathe by magical means. Zenas explored the nebulous land for some time, encountering vaporous creatures and palaces of smoke. Though he never met the prince, we concluded that he was in Ashpit, said to be the home of Malakath, where anguish, betrayal, and broken promises like ash filled bitter air. "The sky is on fire," I heard him say as he moved on to the next realm. "The ground is sludge, but traversable. I see blackened ruins all around me like a war was fought here in the distant past. The air is freezing. I cast plumes of warmth all around me, but it still feels like daggers of ice stabbing me in all directions." This was Cold Harbor, where Molag Bal was prince. It appeared to Zenas as if it were a future Nirn under the King of Rape, desolate and barren, filled with suffering. I could hear Morian Zenas weep at the images he saw and shiver at the sight of the imperial palace, spattered with blood and excrement. "Too much beauty," Zenas gasped when he went to the next realm. "I'm half blind. I see flowers and waterfalls, majestic trees, a city of silver. But it is all a blur. The colors run like water. It's raining now and the wind smells like perfume. This surely is Moon Shadow where Azura dwells." Zenas was right, and astonishingly he even had audience with the Queen of Dusk and Dawn in her Rose Palace. She listened to his tale with a smile and told him of the coming of the Nerevarine. My master found Moon Shadow so lovely he wished to stay there, half blind forever, But he knew he must move on and complete his journey of discovery. "I'm in a storm," he told me as he entered the next realm. He described the landscape of dark, twisted trees, howling spirits and billowing mist, and I thought he might have entered the deadlands of Mehrunes Dagon. But then he said quickly, "No, I'm no longer in a forest. There was a flash of lightning, and now I'm on a ship. The mast is tattered, the crew is slaughtered, something is coming through the waves. Oh gods. Wait, no, I'm in a dank dungeon, in a cell." He was not in the Deadlands, but Quagmire, the nightmare realm of Vermina. That must be a typo. Well, whatever you call it when it's handwritten. Every few minutes there was a flash of lightning, and reality shifted, always to something more horrible and horrifying. A dark castle one moment, a den of ravening beasts the next, a moonlit swamp, coffin where he was buried alive. Fear got the better of my master, and he quickly passed to the next realm. I heard him laugh. "I feel like I'm home now." Morian Zenas described me an endless library, shelves stretching on in every direction, stacks on top of stacks. Oh, that sounds like heaven. Pages floated on a mystical wind that he could not feel. Every book had a black cover with no title. He could see no one, but felt the presence of ghosts moving through the stacks, rifling through books, ever searching. It was Apocrypha, the home of Hermaeus Mora, where all forbidden knowledge can be found. I felt a shudder in my mind, but I could not tell if it was my master's or mine. Morian Zenas never traveled to another realm that I know of. Throughout his visits to the first 4 realms, my master spoke to me constantly. Upon entering the Apocrypha, he became quieter as he was lured into the world of research and study, the passions that had controlled his heart while on Nirn. I would frantically try to call to him, but he closed his mind to me. Then he would whisper, "This cannot be. No one would ever guess the truth. I must learn more. I see the world, alas, illusions shimmer. It is crumbling all around us." I would cry back to him, begging him to tell me what was happening, what he was seeing, what he was learning. I even tried using conjuration to summon him as if he were a Daedra himself, but he refused to leave. Morian Zenas was lost. I last received a whisper from him 6 months ago. Before then it had been 5 years, and 3 before that. His thoughts are no longer intelligible in any language. Perhaps he is still in Apocrypha, lost but happy, in a trap he refuses to escape. Perhaps he slipped between the stacks and passed into the madhouse of Sheogorath, losing his sanity forever. I would save him if I could. I would silence his whispers if I could. Wow, that's quite a book. The Doors of Oblivion. Alright, Last King of the Ayleids by Herminia Athena. The Ayleids, or Heartland Eye Elves, ruled Cyrodiil in the long ages of myth before the beginning of recorded history. One of the earliest recorded dates, in fact, is the fall of the White Gold Tower in First Era 243, which is commonly assumed to mark the end of the Ayleids. Although Ayleid rule over all of Cyrodiil was indeed broken in the First Era 243, this was only one of the most obvious stages near the end of a long decline. The first 2 centuries of the First Era saw increasing strife between the great Ayleid lords of Cyrodiil. Alessia appears to have taken advantage of a period of civil war to launch her uprising. Imperial historians have traditionally attributed her victory to intervention from Skyrim, but it appears that she had at least as much help from rebel Ayleid lords during the siege of the White Gold Tower. The popular image of the Ayleids as brutal slave masters is based in fact, of course, but it is less well known that a number of Ayleid princes continued to rule parts of Cyrodiil after 243 as vassals of the new Empress of Cyrodiil. This suggests either that Ayleid rule was not universally detested, or that Alessia and her successors were more pragmatic than is traditionally believed, or perhaps some of both. In any event, excavations at a number of Ayleid sites show continued occupation and even expansion during the so-called Late Ayleid period, First era 243 to circa 498. At first, many Ayleid lords continued to rule as vassals of the new human regime. In some cases, Ayleid supporters of Alessia were even rewarded with new lands taken from slain enemies. It is not clear to what extent human slavery continued under the Cyrodiilic Empire. Humans continued to dwell in the Ayleid-ruled areas of Cyrodiil, but there is nothing definitive to show under what terms. This was an uneasy relationship from the beginning and was not destined to last long. Resentment at the continued presence of Ayleid nobles within the empire was a contributing factor to the rise of the so-called Alessian order founded by Maruch. The first victims of the Alessians were the Ayleids of Cyrodiil. In the early 300s, the surviving Ayleid communities in human-ruled areas were obliterated, one by one, the refugees temporarily swelling the power of the remaining Ayleid lordships. Then in 361 the Alessians gained control of the empire and enforced the Alessian doctrines throughout its domain. The Ayleid lordships were abolished. Enforcement of this decree does not appear to have required much direct violence. It seems that by this point the balance of power was so overwhelmingly against them, and their fate so long foreshadowed, that most of the remaining Ayleids simply left Cyrodiil, eventually being absorbed into the elven populations of Valenwood and High Rock. Indeed, the rise of the Direni hegemony may be linked to the exodus of Ayleids from Cyrodiil, a connection so far little studied by historians. Still, a remnant Ayleid population seems to have survived the rule of the Alessians, because we hear of the last king of the Ayleids joining the Battle of Glenumbria Moors when the Direnists decisively defeated the Alessians in 482. How this king's people survived the preceding centuries are unknown. We do not even know who they were, although recent research points to Nenalata as the possible resting place of this last king. Unfortunately, in the current state of the empire, funds are no longer available for proper scientific investigation of such extensive ruins, so the answer to these questions will have to be left to future generations. Alright, that was the last king of the Ayleids, and we have one more Night of Tears. Night of Tears by Drunner Seleth. Saarthal holds a prominent place in Skyrim history, even if most do not remember it by name. It is of course the site of one of the first major Nord settlements, one of the first cities of men in Skyrim, and the earliest known capital of their civilization. It was also the site of terrible bloodshed, when the elves attempted to drive the Nords out of Skyrim, to succeed only in incurring their wrath in the form of Isgramor and his fabled 500 companions, who swept the elves from Skyrim and firmly established it as the home of the Nords. All this is known, but little else. What happened on that Night of Tears when Saarthal was razed to the ground? What provoked the elves to such a deliberate, vicious attack? And what prompted such a severe response from the Nords? Vingalma's treatise on the antecedent suggests that the elves of the Merethic era, along with their counterparts, the Dwemer, possessed a degree of sophistication unparalleled in Tamriel. They displayed power beyond what could be expected of the time. While a distinct explanation is not given for this, I believe that this work, compared with the early writings of Esafkirnis, suggests that something greater was at work on that night in Saarthal. The true motives behind the Night of Tears have been obscured to us by the passage of time, but I believe this was not a simple war of territory or of control of Skyrim. I believe that what happened was a significant event based around something very particular. The Nords found something when they built their city buried deep in the ground. They attempted to keep it buried, but the elves learned of it and coveted it for themselves. Thus they assaulted Saarthal, their goal not to drive the Nords out but to secure this power for themselves. I believe Isgramor knew something of what the elves would find on the Saarthal and rallied to gather his people to keep the elves from gaining it. When Nords once again controlled Skyrim, this power was buried deep below the earth and sealed away. Time has kept this knowledge from us, and it is my hope that time will also reveal the truth of these words. Every effort will be made to relocate Saarthal and find that which has been lost to us. And that concludes the reading. Thank you so much. No, we will not follow Hermes Mora. Thank you very much. So, and with that, I'll conclude this reading episode, and then we'll continue with the story of Untitled Chapter.